The heat in the small town didn't match the season. It was early spring, the kind of morning when the sun usually felt soft and the air stayed cool, but something heavier hung over the place. It clung to the streets, to the people walking by, even to the quiet parking lot outside the brick-walled bank on the corner of Maple and 3rd. The town was the sort of place where people still waved at strangers, where the same faces showed up in the same places every day, and where trouble rarely came loudly. It always arrived softly at first, like a whisper no one paid attention to. On that morning, before anything went wrong, the bank looked as normal as ever. A dusty flag tapped lightly against its pole. Cars rolled in and out, people stepped through its double doors with tired eyes and simple plans. Nothing about the building stood out, its fatting sign, its old glass windows, its dim lights inside. But inside those doors, the air felt different. Even the tellers sensed it, though none of them could have explained why. Maybe it was the long faces of the early customers, perhaps the dull hum of the fluorescent bulbs overhead, or maybe it was the strange stillness that sometimes settles right before something breaks. Among the people who passed by the front windows that morning, a few stood out without knowing they did. A thin man in a worn jacket who kept checking his phone. A woman clutching her purse too tightly as if she didn't trust anyone around her. A tall figure leaning against a motorcycle across the street, helmet resting beside him, hair tied back, watching the flow of people with calm, steady eyes. No one inside the bank noticed him, or the 2 other men sitting on their bikes near him. They looked like regular riders passing through, the kind who preferred the edge of town over its main roads. Their presence wasn't unusual in a place where riders came and went all the time. No one knew their names. No one knew what group they belonged to. They stayed quiet and didn't draw attention, but they saw everything. Inside the bank, among the early customers, was an elderly woman with soft gray curls and a thin frame wrapped in a faded coat. She stood in line with the patience of someone who had lived long enough to understand waiting. She held a small envelope in her hand, pressed close to her chest. Her eyes moved slowly around the room, over the walls, the counters, the faces, but they didn't hold fear or confusion, only tiredness. Life had worn her down, not with one hard blow, but with 1,000 small ones across the years. She didn't make a noise. She didn't demand anything. She just waited. Around her, people carried on their usual morning routines, unaware of the small cracks forming between them. The man in the worn jacket kept glancing at the elderly woman, reading something on her face he didn't like. A young teller was tapping her nails nervously on the counter, distracted by something she overheard earlier in the break room. Something about new rules, new pressure from management. A police cruiser rolled slowly down the street outside, its windows down, its 2 officers talking about some call they had taken the night before. Nothing urgent, nothing strange, just noise filling the quiet. But beneath all these small, ordinary moments was something thicker, something growing. The town had been dealing with money issues for months, closures, layoffs, people watching their savings shrink. There was tension between the bank and its customers, small misunderstandings turning into arguments, arguments turning into threats. People didn't trust institutions anymore, and institutions in return didn't trust people. It created a kind of invisible war between everyday citizens and the places meant to keep their lives steady. The elderly woman didn't know she was walking straight into that tension. She didn't know that the people behind the counter were on edge. She didn't know that her simple visit could be twisted into something dangerous by people already prepared to see the worst. She didn't know that someone had whispered something about her before she even made it inside. Some rumor, some suspicion that spread just fast enough to poison the moment. Across the street, the bikers watched the bank doors with the kind of attention that comes from experience. Their world wasn't clean or gentle. They had seen people pushed around, overlooked, and mistreated more times than they cared to count. They noticed the way the police cruiser circled back, slowing this time. They noticed how the officers glanced toward the bank. They noticed how the man in the worn jacket inside reached for his phone again, tapping something quickly. They saw the tightness in his shoulders, the way his mouth pulled thin. Something was being set in motion. Yet no one inside the bank had any idea how fragile everything truly was. It felt like any other morning. People shuffled in line, the teller forced a smile, and the security guard leaned against the wall pretending not to be bored. Life looked calm, safe, predictable. And then there were the smaller details, the ones people usually ignored but later remembered too late. The way the lights flickered once. The way the elderly woman dropped her envelope and bent down slowly to pick it up, just as the door opened and 2 officers stepped inside. The way silence brushed against the room for a brief second before anyone spoke. No one knew the world was about to tilt. No one knew that a simple misunderstanding, a single assumption, would soon unravel into something far bigger than the town had ever seen. Something that would raise questions about power, treatment, and who gets believed. Something that would drag strangers together who never should have crossed paths. Something that would make that quiet group of bikers across the street sit up, their calm eyes sharpening, their stillness turning into something else, something watchful, protective, and dangerous. The first shift in the air happened so quietly that most people inside the bank never caught it. It began with the way the officers walked in, too fast for a routine check, too focused on a single spot in the room. Their eyes cut straight toward the elderly woman as if someone had already painted her as a problem before they even stepped through the door. She didn't notice them at first. She was still smoothing the small envelope in her hands, trying to keep it from wrinkling. Her fingers shook a little, but that came from age, not fear. The man in the worn jacket noticed, though. He watched the officers stop near the entrance and talk softly to the teller at the far counter. Her face tightened. She nodded toward the elderly woman. The jacket man didn't know what was happening, but he could feel something was wrong in the way everyone's eyes started to move. People always sensed trouble in their bones before it showed in their eyes. Across the street, the bikers sat up slowly. They watched the officers step further inside, their shoulders stiff, hands near their belts. None of them liked the look of it. They didn't know the woman, but they knew the kind of calm trouble that grew from fear and assumptions. They had seen scenes like this in too many small towns where people didn't bother to understand before acting. Inside, the tension grew in small, strange ways. The teller who had been tapping her nails earlier now kept her hands tucked under the counter. The security guard's bored expression faded into confusion, then unease. A couple stepping into the bank froze when they saw the officers. The room felt like it was tightening around one point, the elderly woman who still didn't know that her morning had shifted into something dangerous. She moved forward in line, her steps slow. She didn't hear the whispered conversation behind her. She didn't see the glance exchanged between the officers. She was thinking about her grandson, about the medicine he needed, about the bills she still had to pay, about the long walk home if the bus didn't come on time. Everyday worries, ordinary worries. But behind her, the story being written about her, was nothing like the truth. The teller, the same young woman who came to work that morning already anxious, had made a mistake, one she didn't even realize yet. Earlier that month, the bank had put pressure on its workers to report anything even slightly off. Suspicious behavior, large withdrawals, confusing paperwork, anything that could make the bank look like it was fighting fraud and crime at a time when people were losing trust. The staff had been warned that failure to report could cost them their jobs. That responsibility had turned into fear. Fear had turned into overreaction. The elderly woman's account had recently been flagged for unusual activity, not because she did anything wrong, but because she had been moving money between accounts, trying to keep up with endless medical costs. It looked chaotic on paper. It looked like something it was. So when her name popped up in the teller's system, a quiet alarm flashed. The teller felt her heart spike. She didn't want to be the reason the bank got in trouble. She didn't want to risk being blamed for missing something. So she made a call, too fast, without checking properly, and told the local police she had a possible fraud attempt. She didn't expect them to come this quickly. She didn't expect them to walk in ready to act. She didn't expect the weight of her fear to fall on someone who had simply come to withdraw a small amount of cash. Outside pressures had a way of turning normal people into something unrecognizable. As the elderly woman reached the front of the line, the first real spark of conflict snapped into place. She handed her envelope to the teller. Her voice trembled a little, but only from age. "I need to take out a little today," she said. The teller hesitated before touching the envelope. She felt sick, guilty, but she also felt trapped. The officers were close now, watching. The pressure to do the right thing burned through her chest. She forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just a moment," she said. The elderly woman nodded, unaware of the storm building behind her. The officer on the left stepped closer. "Ma'am," he said in a voice too firm, "we're going to need you to step aside with us." The envelope slipped from her hand again. This time she didn't bend quickly to pick it up. She just stared at them, confused. "Did I do something wrong?" The tension snapped higher. The man in the worn jacket shifted his weight, anger starting to rise in him. He didn't know the woman, but he knew what it looked like when someone harmless got treated like a threat. He didn't say anything yet, but the spark had landed inside him, too. Across the street, the biker with the tied-back hair leaned forward. His jaw tightened. He could see the woman's confusion even from a distance. He could see the officer's stances changing, turning rigid. He knew what that meant. He had been around long enough to know when a calm situation was seconds from turning ugly. Inside the bank, the officers guided the elderly woman away from the counter. She tried to ask what was happening, but her voice cracked. Fear finally started to seep through, not because she knew she was in trouble. She wasn't, but because she had lived long enough to know what power looked like when it was pointed at someone vulnerable. The teller's eyes darted to the floor. Her hands shook. She wanted to tell the officers it was a misunderstanding, but the weight of her own fear kept her frozen. She heard the voice of her manager in her head. "If you fail to report suspicious activity, it'll fall on you." She stayed silent. The officers led the elderly woman toward the lobby chairs, but she pulled back slightly, not enough to resist, just enough to show she didn't understand. That small movement was all it took for the situation to escalate. One officer reached for her arm, too fast, too rough. The security guard took a step forward, unsure if he should intervene or stay out of it. The envelope hit the floor again. This time it tore open, papers spilling out. Not fake checks, not stolen IDs, just doctor bills, prescription notes, and her bank information neatly folded inside. The officer didn't look at the papers. He didn't bend to pick them up. He just took her by the arm again, firmer this time, as if the papers didn't prove anything at all. The man in the worn jacket felt his blood heat. "Hey," he said sharply, taking a step forward. "Take it easy." Everyone turned. The room held its breath. The officers stared at him like he was an interruption, not a witness. "Stay back," one warned. The elderly woman looked between them all, her eyes growing wet. She whispered, "Please, I didn't do anything." The teller finally broke, whispering to herself, "Oh God, oh no, what have I done?" But the officers didn't hear her, or didn't want to. Outside, the bikers pushed off their bikes, rising one by one. They weren't loud. They didn't shout. They just stood there, their presence suddenly heavy, as if the ground shifted under them. They didn't plan to walk in, not yet, but they had the look of men who wouldn't let this go if the situation turned worse. Inside, things spiraled faster. The officers decided to detain her. It didn't make sense. It didn't need to. Power often didn't. When they tried to pull her up from the chair, she stiffened, not in rebellion but in fear. Her voice cracked into a small cry. "Please don't hurt me, please, I'm not doing anything wrong." That single moment cracked something open in the room. The teller covered her mouth. A couple in line stepped back, whispering to each other. The man in the jacket clenched his fists. And the officers, feeling watched and challenged, doubled down. "Ma'am, stop resisting." The woman wasn't resisting, she was trembling. This was the pivot point, the moment when everything could still be fixed if someone stepped up, admitted a mistake, and slowed things down. But no one did. Fear pushed the officers. Fear held the teller silent. Fear filled the room. Across the street, the bikers started walking toward the bank doors. Inside, the officers forced the elderly woman to stand. Her knees buckled. She cried out. The man in the jacket cursed under his breath and moved closer, ignoring the officers' warnings. The envelope papers fluttered across the floor like scattered snow, medical papers, unpaid bills, the quiet proof of a life struggling under the weight she carried alone. And still, the officers didn't stop. Every outside pressure, every fear, every prejudice, every misunderstanding wound itself into the moment, pulling everyone into a situation none of them could escape now. The bikers reached the door. The officers tightened their hold. The woman cried out again. The room snapped, and the story began to turn deadly. The moment the bikers pushed open the bank doors, the officers jerked their heads toward the sound. The glass rattled against the metal frame, and the air inside the room shifted again, this time sharp enough for everyone to feel. The men didn't rush inside. They walked in with a steady, grounded force, the kind that demanded attention without a single word. Their boots thudded against the tiles. Their shadows stretched across the floor, crossing the scattered papers the elderly woman had dropped. The officers stiffened immediately. Their grips tightened on the woman whose legs could barely hold her upright, and now she was caught between two kinds of fear. She didn't know whether to be afraid of the men coming in or the men already holding her. Her breath came fast and broken. Her heart felt like it was shrinking with every beat. The lead biker, the one with the tied-back hair, looked straight at her first. Not at the officers, not at the people starring. His eyes softened for just a second. He saw the tears on her face, the way she shook, the way she tried to speak but couldn't form the words. He saw the pain, the age, the fear, and something inside him burned hot. Then his gaze snapped to the officers, and everything inside him hardened again. "What's going on here?" he asked, voice low and steady. One officer stepped forward, jaw clenched. "This is police business, step back." The biker didn't blink. "Doesn't look like business, looks like you're roughing up a woman who can barely stand." The officer shot back, "She's resisting." The elderly woman shook her head weakly, whispering, No, I'm not." The biker's fists curled. His friends behind him stepped wider, forming a silent wall. The entire bank went completely still, so still that the hum of the fluorescent lights suddenly sounded too loud, too sharp. The tension stretched until it felt like the air itself was about to snap. The man in the worn jacket moved beside the bikers. His voice cracked with anger. "She didn't resist. You came in here looking for a problem." That was the moment everything slipped past the point of control. One officer shoved the man in the jacket back with one hand. Hard, the man stumbled into a chair. The crowd gasped. The biker closest to him moved fast, stepping between them before the officer could do more. The officer's hand shot to his holster, instinct, fear, and adrenaline mixing into something reckless. The lead biker lifted both hands to show he wasn't attacking, but his voice came out sharp. "Don't even think about it." The elderly woman cried out, panic ripping through her chest. Her knees gave out beneath her, and when she fell, the officer still gripping her arm pulled her down too roughly. She hit the floor with a crack that echoed louder than anything else in the room. Her cry was raw pain, fear, humiliation, all mixed into something unbearable. That sound broke whatever thin thread the moment had left. The second officer lunged toward the riders, shouting something half-formed, but he didn't get far. One of the bikers grabbed his arm to stop him, not attacking, just preventing him from drawing his weapon. But the officer panicked, pulling harder, slipping, losing balance. And then everything exploded. The officer fell sideways and crashed into the teller counter. Papers flew. The teller screamed and ducked. The officer hit the ground and rolled, reaching again for his holster. The biker who had grabbed him stepped back, hands up, shouting that he wasn't fighting. But the officer didn't hear anything except the sound of his own fear pounding in his ears. The lead officer, seeing his partner down, mistook everything happening at once as an attack. He drew his taser with a snap. The elderly woman was still on the floor, trying to speak, her breath coming in short gasps. She tried to push herself up. Her body trembled. She was caught in the middle of chaos she didn't understand, between people she didn't know, her vision blurring from pain. The taser clicked. The lead biker yelled, "Don't you dare." The officer fired. The wires shot out, slicing through the air, and struck not the biker he was aiming for, but the elderly woman on the floor. Her body jolted violently, her eyes widened in shock. The scream that tore from her throat didn't sound human, it sounded like something breaking for good. Her hands clawed at the floor as electricity ripped through her fragile frame. People screamed. The teller fell to her knees, sobbing. The man in the jacket shouted a string of curses, rushing toward her. The taser cycle lasted only seconds, but it felt like an entire lifetime folded into a moment no one could ever forget. When it stopped, she collapsed completely, her body limp and twisted, the wires still attached to her thin chest. Silence hit the bank like a wave. The officer stared at her, horror slowly creeping into his eyes. No. The lead biker dropped to his knees beside her. His hands shook as he tried to lift her gently, calling to her in a voice thick with disbelief. "Ma'am, hey, look at me, okay? Stay with me, stay with me." She didn't answer. Her eyes fluttered, unfocused. Her breathing was shallow, uneven. Her lips moved, but she couldn't form the words she wanted to say. The second officer finally stood, panic taking over. It was an accident, she got in the way. The lead biker snapped his head toward him, rage swirling through him, dark and cold. He looked like he could tear the officer apart with his bare hands, but he didn't move. His hands stayed on the woman, trying to keep her conscious, trying to keep her alive. The rest of the bikers stood behind him, covering him, watching the officers with the kind of fury that could swallow a man whole. They didn't reach for weapons. They didn't move to attack, but the weight of their silence was more dangerous than any shout. The officer who fired the taser backed away, hands shaking. I didn't. She resisted, I thought. His voice crumbled into nothing. His eyes darted between the woman and the bikers, knowing he had crossed a line he could never step back from. People in the bank were frozen in fear, confusion, and disbelief. A few reached for their phones. Others covered their mouths. The security guard stood like a statue, unsure which side to move toward. The woman's breathing slipped again. The biker lifted her head gently, whispering, "Stay with me, please." Her eyes met his for a second, just one, and something in them seemed to say she was tired, so tired. Her body sagged. No, he whispered, shaking his head as if refusing could turn back time. The officer lunged forward, trying to help now, too late. We need to call an ambulance, now. One of the bikers grabbed his chest and shoved him back. Don't touch her. The teller crawled out from behind the counter, tears running down her face. This wasn't supposed to, I didn't mean. Nobody listened, her guilt drowned in the chaos. The lead biker pressed his hand to the woman's back, feeling her heartbeat weaken. He looked around the room as if begging anyone, to do something. But everyone was too shocked to move. The seconds dragged on, each one heavier than the last. The officer who fired the taser pressed his hands to his head. His voice broke apart. I'm sorry, oh God, I'm sorry. Panic pulled at him from every angle, fear of what he had done, fear of the bikers, fear of the consequences. His breathing sped up until he was nearly hyperventilating. He stumbled backward, hitting the wall, sliding down it until he was crouched on the floor. The elderly woman made one more fragile sound, then went silent. The biker froze. The room froze. And then the truth hit him with brutal force. He pressed his forehead to her shoulder. No. His voice cracked, raw, desperate, helpless. The other bikers lowered their heads, grief mixing with a rage so deep it felt like an old, familiar wound being torn open again. The officers stood stunned, the weight of what had happened pressing down on them so hard it took their breath away. The one who fired the taser forced out the words, "Call it in, call it in." But his partner didn't move. He was staring at the woman's still body like he'd just watched his own life end, too. Chaos had landed like a hammer, shattering the quiet world they all walked into only minutes before. Inside the bank, nobody was the same anymore. And outside, the news would soon spread. People would scream for justice. People would scream for answers. But for now, all that filled the room was fear, grief, and the slow, crushing realization that a line had been crossed that could never be erased. The bank emptied slowly, like people were afraid that even leaving the building might draw suspicion onto them. Paramedics arrived too late. They moved with purpose at first, but their hands slowed as soon as they touched the elderly woman's still body. Their faces shifted, softening with that quiet look medical workers get when they know there's nothing they can reverse. The bikers didn't move aside when the stretcher came through. They formed a wall around her until one medic gently asked them to let her go. Only then did the lead biker step back, jaw clenched so tightly that his teeth ached. He watched them lift her with soft hands, but the sight still felt violent to him, like the world kept taking from her even after she had nothing left to give. The two officers stood in the corner, separated from everyone else as if the air around them had turned toxic. Their radios crackled nonstop with voices asking for updates, supervisors demanding information. The one who fired the taser kept wiping at his face like he could scrub the moment off of his skin. He whispered to his partner over and over, I didn't mean to, but saying it didn't change anything. His partner tried to calm him, but even he couldn't look the man in the eyes. Outside, the sun was still up, still bright, still warm. It didn't care what had just happened. But the street felt wrong, like the light had dimmed, like a shadow had been pulled over the whole town. People gathered on the sidewalks, whispering fast and nervously. Some filmed the scene, some cried, some shook their heads like they couldn't believe something like this could happen here of all places. The bikers followed the stretcher out, walking behind it not as a threat, but as if escorting someone they loved. They didn't speak. Their silence was louder than any shouting. The moment the paramedics closed the ambulance doors, the lead biker pressed a hand against the cold metal, letting his head drop. One of the others rested a hand on his shoulder, steadying him. It was too late for anything else. The officers were escorted outside next, surrounded by other police who had rushed to the scene. They weren't handcuffed, not yet, but people noticed how their faces were pale and shaken. It didn't matter to the crowd that they looked scared. Fear wasn't enough, not after what happened. The whispers around them grew sharper. They killed her. She didn't resist. She was harmless. They didn't even check her papers. Someone shouted, "Say her name," but no one even knew it yet. The crowd didn't care. Payne didn't wait for details. The officers were taken away for questioning. The one who fired the taser kept looking around, searching the faces for any sign of understanding or forgiveness. He didn't find any, not from the crowd, not from the bikers, not from himself. Inside the station, hours later, he sat in a small interview room with his head in his hands. His fingers trembled. He tried to explain what happened, but every word tasted like metal. "I thought she was resisting," he said, voice cracking. "I panicked." "Why did you think she was resisting?" one investigator asked. He didn't answer at first. When he finally did, his voice was small. "She pulled away. I didn't know she was scared, I just reacted." He didn't mention that his heart was already racing when he walked into the bank, or that he had been under pressure from complaints filed in the past, or that he had come in with the expectation that the elderly woman might be dangerous because someone had labeled her that way. He didn't know how to put those things into words without sounding like he was blaming everyone but himself. But he wasn't the only one drowning in guilt. The teller sat alone in the staff room, wrapped in a blanket someone had given her. Her manager tried to talk to her, but she barely heard anything. She kept seeing the envelope, the medical bills, the woman's face when the officers first approached her. The way she had looked scared, confused, and embarrassed. She pressed her hands over her ears as if she could block out the memories. Her manager kept repeating, "You followed procedure." But the words didn't help. She wanted to scream that she didn't follow her conscience. She wanted to admit that she acted out of fear, not logic. But every time she tried to speak, her throat locked. She kept replaying the phone call she made, hearing her own voice ask for officers to come check suspicious activity. It sounded different now, selfish, careless, destructive. That night, she didn't go home. She didn't think she deserved to rest. She didn't think she deserved anything at all. In the far part of town, in a small, quiet house, the elderly woman's grandson answered the door to police officers who stood stiff and silent. He was only a teenager. His eyes widened as they explained. The sound he made when they told him felt too heavy to come from someone so young. He collapsed to the floor, gripping the officer's legs, begging them to take it back. He kept saying, "She was just going to the bank. She said she'd be back in an hour." One officer placed a hand on the boy's back. The other looked away, ashamed. By morning, the whole town knew her name, knew her story, knew her pain, knew her grandson's tears. The news stations arrived early. Reporters stood in front of the bank, giving updates with serious voices and grave expressions. The story spread beyond the town faster than anyone expected. It was shared online with anger, with heartbreak, with disgust. People compared it to other cases. People cried over someone they had never met. People blamed the officers. Others blamed the bank. Some blamed the system. The bikers stayed in town. They didn't leave after the woman's body was taken away. They stayed near the bank for hours, leaning against their motorcycles, staring at the closed doors like they were guarding the memory of what happened. People approached them, asking questions, offering condolences, and asking if they knew the woman. They didn't, but it didn't matter. They had seen injustice before. They knew how quickly the world moved on from stories like hers if no one held on to them. The lead biker hardly spoke. He kept replaying the moment over and over, the fall, the scream, the shock that went through her body. He tried to imagine what she felt. He tried to imagine what he could have done differently. He kept blaming himself for not stepping in sooner, for not pulling the officers away, for not stopping the cycle from hitting her in the first place. His friends told him it wasn't his fault. He didn't believe them. In his motel room that night, he didn't sleep. He sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. He felt rage inside him, old and deep, mixing with grief so heavy it seemed to crush his chest. He thought of all the times he'd seen people like her get ignored, dismissed, mistreated. And now he had watched one die right in front of him while he stood helpless. The next morning, the town courthouse steps were filled with people holding candles. Some carried signs. Some held photos of the woman printed from the news reports. Her face, soft, warm, tired, looked out over the crowd from dozens of sheets of paper. Her grandson stood at the front, holding a candle with shaking hands, surrounded by neighbors and strangers who whispered words of comfort he didn't hear. The officers were suspended pending investigation. The department released a statement saying it was an unfortunate incident. Those words sparked more anger. People flooded the police station lobby demanding justice. But inside the locked offices, the officers involved broke down in different ways. The one who fired the taser shut himself in his home, blinds closed, lights off. His wife begged him to talk, but he wouldn't. He sat in the dark, replaying the moment over and over until his mind felt bruised. He wanted to tell himself he didn't mean to hurt her, but the truth kept rising in him. He had reacted out of fear, not reason. He didn't know how to face that. His partner avoided sleep for days. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the woman's fall. He heard her cry. He kept thinking about how he could have stopped his partner, how one word or one step might have changed everything. He started drinking to dull the images, but it didn't work. Nothing worked. The teller took leave from work. She couldn't walk into the bank again. She couldn't stand the thought of people recognizing her, whispering, telling the story about how she made a call that ended a woman's life. She thought about quitting, but she kept thinking about the woman's grandson and how one day he might walk into that bank. She couldn't face him, not ever. The town became divided. Some people blamed the officers, others blamed the bank's policies. A few blamed the bikers, insisting their presence escalated the situation, even though everyone knew the truth. But the loudest voices demanded justice for the woman. Her funeral brought even more people than expected. Strangers stood alongside family members, crying as if they had known her personally. The bikers came too, dressed in clean clothes, standing in the back, heads bowed. They didn't approach the family. They didn't speak to the crowd. They came for her and then they left quietly. But the lead biker stayed behind after everyone else walked away. He approached her grandson slowly. The boy looked up, eyes swollen, cheeks streaked with dried tears. The biker knelt beside him and whispered, "I'm sorry I couldn't save her." The boy didn't blame him. He leaned against the biker, exhausted. And for the first time since the day at the bank, the man allowed himself to cry. The town would remember the woman for a long time. Her story would change things, policies, training, the way people looked at the world around them. But change didn't bring comfort. It didn't bring her back. It didn't ease the weight on the hearts of those who saw her last moments. And the guilt, the grief, and the anger would follow each of them for the rest of their lives. In the months that followed, the case settled into the kind of quiet that doesn't feel peaceful. It was the kind that lingers in the corners of rooms, showing up in the pauses during conversations and the long stares at the floor. Everyone involved had been changed, and whether they admitted it or not, none of them would ever return to the lives they once lived. The town tried to continue with its routines, but the truth hung over everything like a cloud that refused to move. Some people tried to convince themselves that justice had been done, that the story ended the way it was supposed to, but even they couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling that the whole disaster had left behind. Dean sat in a cell 2 hours outside the city, waiting for the day he would stand before a judge and hear the length of the sentence that would define the rest of his life. He didn't fight anymore, didn't argue or blame anyone else. The anger that used to burn so hot in him had cooled to something he didn't fully recognize, an emptiness, a space where he had finally faced what he had become. In the quiet moments before lights out, he replayed the night of the crime over and over again. The shouting, the fear, the split-second decisions that ripped apart every person he once cared about. Sometimes he tried to tell himself that things could have gone differently, but the truth broke through every time. His choices had led him there. The violence had always been his, even when he tried to blame life, money, stress, or unfair chances. Visited once, sitting across from him in the cold visiting room, her hands trembling as she held a cheap styrofoam cup. She didn't yell at him. She didn't cry. She just looked tired, older somehow, as if the months had carved new lines into her face. She told him that their mother still asked about him sometimes, but she left out the way she hesitated every time his name came up, as if she wasn't sure it was safe to hope for anything good anymore. When stood to leave, she placed her hand on the glass for a moment, waiting for him to lift his. He did, but neither of them spoke. There were no words left that could make sense of the damage. Miriam stayed in the hospital for weeks before she was well enough to return home. Even then, she moved slowly, choosing her steps with care, as if the world itself had become sharper, more dangerous. She didn't talk about what happened, not to her family, not to her neighbors who brought food and flowers, and certainly not to the reporters who waited outside in hopes of getting her to say something emotional on camera. She ignored them all. She had never been a woman who liked attention, and now the thought of strangers knowing her pain felt like another violation. What she held inside stayed inside, locked behind the calm expression she forced herself to wear in public. But in quiet moments she broke. Her daughter found her once in the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter so hard her knuckles had turned white. Miriam didn't try to hide it. She just stood there, shaking, while her daughter wrapped her arms around her from behind. Even then, she didn't cry. The tears never came, no matter how badly she needed them. It was as if the fear and the humiliation had dried something inside her that she didn't know how to bring back. The town took sides, as towns often do. Some saw Miriam as a symbol of everything wrong with how the police handled fragile situations, especially involving people who didn't have money or status. Others insisted the officers had only acted on what they saw and couldn't be blamed for a misunderstanding that spiraled out of control. The argument spread online, then into community meetings, then into the news. People who had never met Miriam or Dean spoke about them, as if they were fictional characters in a story they had the right to rewrite. The police department faced months of pressure, protests outside the station, angry letters, public demands for new training. The officers who had been involved gave statements that were carefully worded, but those who watched the footage of the incident couldn't shake the sense that something deeply wrong had been exposed. The chief issued apologies, promising reforms, promising better judgment in the future, but not everyone believed the promises. Trust, once broken, never returns in full. The Hell's Angels, who had witnessed the moment everything went wrong, kept their distance in the aftermath. They didn't step forward with interviews or dramatic statements. They didn't seek credit or blame, but people whispered about them anyway, how they had stepped in, how they had shielded Miriam when no one else did. For once, their reputation wasn't built on fear, but on the strange, unexpected truth that even men with rough lives and dangerous associations sometimes saw a wrong more clearly than anyone else. In the end, justice felt like a puzzle with pieces missing. Dean faced his sentence, but prison didn't solve the pain he caused. Miriam survived, but survival wasn't the same as healing. The officers kept their jobs, though some left soon after, unable to shake the guilt of how quickly they had misjudged a fragile moment. The town moved on in the way towns do, slowly, unevenly, turning the story into something people referenced quietly but never fully confronted. Late one evening, months after the court cases ended, Miriam sat on her porch and watched the sun set behind the houses across the street. The world looked ordinary again, peaceful even. But she knew how easily that peace could crack. She knew now that danger didn't always come from dark alleys or strangers. Sometimes it came from the people called to protect you. Sometimes it came from someone you once cared about. And sometimes it came from life itself, breaking open in ways you never expect. She closed her eyes and breathed in the cool air, letting the quiet settle around her. She wasn't sure if what happened would ever fully leave her. She wasn't sure if she wanted it to. The pain was part of her story now, part of who she had become. The case left behind questions that no courtroom had answered. Questions about power, judgment, fear, and the lines people crossed when pushed too far. It showed how fragile people could become under pressure and how quickly a small mistake could explode into something irreversible. It forced the town, and anyone who heard the story, to face the uncomfortable truth that justice wasn't as simple as guilt or innocence. It was complicated, messy, touched by human flaws, and shaped by who society chose to believe. In the silence of that evening, Miriam realized she didn't care any more about the debates, the headlines, or the strangers analyzing her life. What mattered was that she was still here, still standing, still breathing in a world that had tried to take something from her but hadn't taken everything. And somewhere in a prison cell, Dean sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at the floor, finally understanding the weight of all he'd done. He understood that forgiveness might never come, and even if it did, it wouldn't erase the fact that he had crossed a line he could never step back over. Life moved forward, but not in a way that forgot. It moved with the memory, carrying the lesson that sometimes the most dangerous things grow quietly inside familiar places, inside familiar people. And when the moment breaks, when everything collapses into violence and fear, the truth comes out in ways no one can hide from. Justice had been served, at least on paper. But the real justice, the kind that heals, the kind that changes people, was something each of them had to search for on their own. In the end, none of them found the answers they wanted. But they found something else, the understanding that every choice matters, every moment carries weight, and even the smallest crack in someone's life can lead to a fall no one sees coming. And with that knowledge, the story finally settled into its quiet place, leaving behind the echoes of what happens when power, fear, and human weakness collide. and reminding anyone who heard it how easily a normal day can turn into something that changes everything.